Welcome to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. Close your eyes, relax, and let me take you into the story. Great Expectations begins in a place so bare and open that memory seems to have no shelter. There are only the marshes, the wind, the flat horizon, the graves, and the sea breathing far away beyond the reeds. Out of that wide and haunted emptiness comes one of the most unforgettable openings in Dickens. A small child trying to imagine who he is by reading names carved on stone. Pip, with almost nothing to hold on to, makes his first picture of his parents from the shapes of letters on their tombs. It is a tender and frightening beginning, because the world has not yet become solid for him. It is made of guesswork, weather, and fear. Then fear takes bodily form. A convict rises from the marsh as if the landscape itself had broken open. He is starving, shaking, iron-bound, and desperate. The scene is often remembered for its terror. Yet what matters just as much is the strange moral confusion it creates. Pip is frightened almost beyond thought, but he is also drawn into pity before he has words for pity. The book's first lesson is not about crime and innocence in a legal sense. It is about how terror and compassion can arrive together in the same trembling heart. The marshes remain all through the novel as the geography of first feeling. They're the land of exposure, where no social performance can yet fully hide what one is. Shame begins there, but not only shame. So does conscience. Pip learns early that the soul can be caught between dread of punishment and tenderness toward another creature. He steals food and a file, and the act is both guilty and generous. In Dickens, the heart is rarely simple. One emotion leans into another like mist folding over water. That is why the opening does more than launch a plot. It establishes the moral weather of the whole book. Great Expectations will become a story of money, class, manners, and misrecognition. But beneath all that, it remains faithful to the child's first sensations on the marsh. Loneliness, exposure, longing to be safe, and the sudden shock of discovering that even a frightening stranger may deserve mercy. And so memory in this novel is shaped not like a neat staircase, but like weather returning. The mist comes back. The iron comes back. The sense of being watched by the dead, judged by the living, and summoned by something deeper than rules comes back again and again. In this way, Great Expectations begins not with confidence, but with exposure, and from that exposure, Dickens draws a lifelong education of feeling. From the marshes, the novel moves inward, toward the forge, the kitchen, the small household where warmth exists beside humiliation. The forge should feel safe. It glows, it rings, it feeds the body with bread and the room with firelight. Joe Gargery belongs to that warmth. He is large, gentle, awkward, and faithful, a man whose goodness does not arrive in polished speech but in steady presence. Around him, the world can still be rough, but it is rough in an honest way, the way iron is rough before it is shaped. Yet for Pip, home is never simply comfort. Childhood poverty in Great Expectations is not painted as pure innocence. It is mixed with embarrassment from the start. Mrs. Joe's harshness, the constant reminder of being brought up by hand, the scarcity of refinement, the coarse table manners, the sense that one is being measured and found lacking before one even knows by what standard. These things begin to press on Pip's mind very early. He does not merely want safety. He wants escape from the feeling of being low. Dickens is too wise to make the forge either a sentimental paradise or a prison. It is instead a world of real nourishment that Pip does not yet know how to value. But because shame has already entered the boy's imagination, he cannot receive the goodness around him without also feeling its social smallness. The secret act of kindness toward the convict belongs to this phase of the book as well. Pip steals from his own poor household to relieve another sufferer, and that act leaves a deep print on the conscience. He fears discovery, yet something more durable than fear is taking shape. Great Expectations is interested in guilt not as a courtroom verdict, but as an inward atmosphere. Pip carries guilt the way a child carries a sound heard at night. It lingers, changes form, and teaches him that the self is never sealed off from others. At the Forge, Dickens also plants the contrast that will govern the novel's emotional life. The difference between what shines and what warms. Gentility will later shine. London will shine. Estella will shine. But the Forge warms. Joe warms. Biddy warms. One of the tender sadnesses of the book is that Pip must travel far into illusion before he can understand that warmth is rarer, harder to recognize, and more life-giving than brilliance. So childhood in Great Expectations is not simply the beginning of Pip's life story. It is the workshop where shame and kindness are fused together, where class consciousness is born beside gratitude, and where Dickens quietly teaches that the heart can be educated badly by humiliation long before it is educated well by love. Then comes Satis House, and with it one of the strangest interiors in literature. If the marshes are exposed to wind and sky, Satis House is sealed against time. The name promises enoughness, but inside there is stoppage, dust, candlelight at the wrong hour, curtained air, and the heavy stillness of an old injury refusing burial. It is a house arranged like a ritual of grievance. The clocks do not move. The bridal feast decays in public. The room is not merely haunted by the past. It is trained to serve the past every day. For Pip, entering this place is like walking into a dream that teaches him desire in the language of insult. Estella does not enchant him by kindness. She wounds him into longing. Her contempt gives him a new mirror in which to see himself as common, thick-handed, and ashamed. That is one of Dickens's sharpest insights. Desire is often educated not by beauty alone, but by humiliation. We ache not only for what is lovely, but for what makes us feel unworthy and therefore restless to become someone else. Miss Havisham presides over this education like a damaged priestess of repetition. She displays her own frozen wound and turns it into theater. Yet Dickens does not present her as a symbol only. She is also a person who has allowed suffering to harden into ritual. In Great Expectations, pain becomes most dangerous when it stops moving. Grief can ripen into wisdom, but grievance, endlessly rehearsed, becomes a climate that deforms everyone who breathes it. Satis House is therefore more than a Gothic setting. It is the school of performance. Nothing there grows naturally. Feeling is staged, tested, manipulated, observed. Pip learns to watch himself from the outside. He begins to imagine life as a scene in which he has been badly cast. This is the beginning of a false education, one that teaches him to rank appearances above affections. The boy who once feared the convict in the marsh now begins to fear his own origins in a subtler way. And yet the house exerts real power because it concentrates truths as well as delusions. The world does wound people. Love and vanity do mingle. Pride and injury do create ceremonies that survive long after joy is gone. The rotting feast and yellowing bridal dress are absurd, but they are also moving because they show how human beings cling to the exact moment that broke them, hoping still to command it by preserving its furniture. By the time Pip leaves Satis' house, the novel has shifted from fear to aspiration, from bodily danger to social desire. But the atmosphere remains one of enchantment mixed with decay. Great Expectations asks us to notice how often the soul mistakes coldness for superiority, and how often a young heart accepts cruelty as refinement when it has not yet learned the feel of mature love. Once the dream of becoming a gentleman enters the novel, Great Expectations begins to examine class not as a simple ladder, but as a kind of fantasy costume stitched out of shame. Money appears with magical force, and Pip is given what seems like a new future. Yet, Dickens never lets the transformation become pure wish fulfillment. From the first, the promise carries a faint unease, as if the fabric of the dream were already fraying at the seams. To become a gentleman, in Pip's imagination, is to be relieved of awkwardness, coarseness, labor, and visible need. It is to move from the forge into rooms where nothing suits the hands, where speech itself appears cleaner, where one can be looked at without embarrassment. But because the desire is born from wounded self-consciousness, the new identity cannot settle into peace. It is haunted by the self it was meant to bury. This is why Dickens treats gentility with such delicate irony. Manners matter in the novel, but they are not reliable measures of worth. Clothes alter posture. Income alters confidence. Education alters expression. Still, none of these automatically makes a heart more generous, more honest, or more brave. The tragedy of Pip's rise is not that he wants to grow, but that he confuses growth with social translation. He imagines that crossing a class boundary will heal an inner wound that is actually moral and emotional in nature. As he prepares to leave Joe and Biddy, the book becomes painfully alert to self-betrayal. Shame sharpens into condescension. Gratitude weakens under the pressure of imagined refinement. Pip begins to see Joe not with the eyes of love, but with the anxious eyes of spectators who are not even present. This is one of the cruelest powers of class desire. It makes a person anticipate judgment so intensely that he begins to judge on behalf of others. Dickens refuses easy simplification here. He knows that aspiration has dignity in it. Great Expectations does not mock the wish to rise. It mourns the cost when rise becomes repudiation, when self-improvement borrows its energy from self-disgust. So the gentleman dream in this book is both glittering and unstable. It offers possibility, but it also tempts Pip into theatrical living, into inhabiting a version of himself designed for admiration rather than truth. The deeper question of the novel becomes clearer, not whether one can change condition, but whether one can do so without forfeiting tenderness, memory, and the ability to recognize goodness when it arrives without elegance. London receives Pip as a city of rooms, staircases, offices, dinner invitations, rented appearances, and constantly circulating money that never quite seems to belong to anyone for long. It is not the triumphant capital of fulfilled ambition. It is a maze of interiors where hope becomes expense and improvement becomes performance. Dickens is brilliant on the emotional weather of such places. The dusty law chambers, the cluttered lodgings, the social calls that must be answered, the small humiliations hidden beneath polished surfaces. In London, gentility becomes daily labor of another kind. Pip must learn how to inhabit expectations, how to spend, how to receive letters, how to appear at ease among forms he has not grown into naturally. Herbert Pocket brings warmth and companionship, and the friendship matters because it keeps the city from becoming entirely airless. But even friendship cannot remove the loneliness of becoming. Pip is not at home in the old world anymore, and he is not inwardly at home in the new one either. This is where the novel's understanding of improvement becomes especially subtle. To improve oneself sounds clean and admirable. Yet, Great Expectations shows how improvement, when tied to class fantasy, can produce debt of every kind. Financial debt, certainly, but also emotional debt, performative debt, borrowed habits, borrowed confidence, borrowed identity. Pip is always paying toward an image of himself that recedes the moment he approaches it. The city is full of clerks, porters, lawyers, clients, servants, and dinner guests, and Dickens lets us feel that respectability rests upon innumerable transactions. Jaggers stands at the center of one system of power, controlled, formidable, inscrutable. Wemmick divides himself between the office and the little domestic fortress of Walworth, reminding us that modern life already requires compartments of the soul. For Pip, London also deepens the ache of absence. Joe belongs to another moral climate, and the longer Pip delays honest gratitude, the heavier the delay becomes. Estella remains radiant and remote, turning desire into a discipline of disappointment. Ambition, in Dickens, is often less a confident reaching upward than a nervous attempt to deserve one's own fantasies. That is why the city feels lonely even when it is crowded. Pip has gained mobility, yet he has not gained peace. He has acquired means, yet not meaning. The novel allows the glamour of enlargement, but it also listens for the hollow note inside it. Great Expectations understands that loneliness is not only being unseen. Sometimes it is being busily seen in a role that does not answer to the deepest truth of who you are. As the book matures, Miss Havisham and Estella emerge not merely as objects of fascination, but as damaged instruments shaped by an old wound that has been made hereditary through performance. Miss Havisham once suffered betrayal, but instead of grieving toward freedom, she raised her injury into a private system and taught it to another heart. Estella is the most elegant result of that teaching. Beautiful, poised, perceptive, and trained to separate charm from tenderness. What Great Expectations sees with unusual clarity is that emotional damage can become instructional. A hurt person may begin to form others in the image of the hurt. Love is withheld, vulnerability is mocked, and admiration is prized because it can be controlled from a distance. Estella does not simply choose coldness in the easy moral sense. She has been educated into it, shaped to believe that feeling is weakness and that power lies in making others ache. Yet Dickens never allows this to become an excuse that dissolves responsibility. The novel's moral world is gentler and sterner than that. People are formed by what they have suffered, but they are not therefore relieved of the pain they cause. That doubleness gives the book its mature emotional texture. We can pity Miss Havisham and still recoil from the atmosphere she creates. We can understand Estella's training and still feel the sorrow of her injuries given outward. Against this frozen inheritance, the memory of Joe and Biddy quietly glows. Dickens places enormous weight on their modest kindness because kindness in this novel is the most difficult and least theatrical virtue. It does not shimmer the way wounded pride shimmers. It waits, reads, forgives, tends, and does not advertise itself. Miss Havisham's tragic grandeur depends on stoppage, on the refusal to let time perform its healing or humbling work. Joe and Biddy belong to another order, one in which time means labor, patience, meals, letters, and the repeated acts by which life is sustained. Great Expectations is fascinated by spectacle, but in the end it trusts steadiness more. It knows that the soul may be dazzled by cold brilliance and saved by ordinary devotion. So when Pip continues to desire Stella, the ache is not merely romantic. He is still under the influence of a false schooling, still confusing emotional difficulty with value, still imagining that the unattainable must be superior to the available good. Dickens lets that illusion deepen because he wants the eventual moral awakening to reach beyond romance into the whole question of what kind of life a human being should honor. The revelation of the true benefactor turns the novel inside out. What had seemed like a fairy tale of hidden patronage suddenly reveals its coarse and human underside. The fortune does not come from Miss Havisham arranging a refined destiny. It comes from Magwitch, the convict of the marshes, the figure of terror from Pip's earliest memory, who has carried the boy in his heart across years, oceans, punishment, and risk. In one stroke, Dickens forces ambition to look directly at the body it wished to forget. This is one of the boldest moral reversals in the novel because it exposes how deeply Pip's hopes have been entangled with class disgust. Gratitude should rush forward, and in part it does. Pip is moved, shaken, indebted in the deepest sense. Yet another feeling rises beside it: revulsion, shame, social horror. The gentleman dream has been funded by a man he cannot easily place inside that dream. The source of his advancement is not elegance, but transport, labor, violence, and outlaw history. Here, Great Expectations becomes mercilessly honest about the divisions inside the self. We like to imagine that our better feelings will instantly govern us. Dickens knows otherwise. Pip's soul does not divide cleanly into noble and base. It becomes a battlefield where conscience struggles against vanity, gratitude against disgust, human recognition against social reflex. The pain of the scene comes from that truthfulness. Moral awakening is rarely graceful at first. Magwitch himself enlarges the book's emotional range. He is rough, proud, wounded, affectionate, dangerous, and deeply loyal. So benefaction in this novel is not pure. It is mixed with vengeance, desire, projection, and love. Dickens understands that people give not only from generosity, but from hunger to see themselves redeemed through another life. Once the revelation has occurred, Pip's real education begins. He must choose whether human attachment can survive the collapse of social illusion. Can he honor the man before him once the fantasy of aristocratic sponsorship is gone? Can he discover tenderness where his ambition trained him to recoil? The answers do not come instantly, which is why they matter. Rain, secrecy, fear of discovery, and a sense of the whole dream turning dark create a new atmosphere around the story. Yet there is also a strange clearing in it. For the first time, Pip is forced to ask not what life will make of him, but what sort of person he will be when the source of his comfort offends his vanity. Great Expectations places that question at the center of adulthood. From here, the novel moves through shadows of crime, law, and loyalty, showing how respectability rests beside violence more closely than polite society likes to admit. The legal world in Dickens is full of ritual, authority, and intimidating intelligence. Yet beneath its polished surfaces are prisons, transported bodies, blackmail, fear, and histories that polite conversation prefers not to name. Great Expectations never lets us believe that the respectable are cleanly separate from the condemned. Jaggers, formidable and controlled, stands as one emblem of this ambiguity. He moves among criminals and gentlemen with the same hard competence, and his office seems to absorb all distinctions into procedure. Wemmick, with his divided life, reveals another truth. Institutions can train people to split themselves in order to survive. Magwitch's story and the threats that surround him force Pip to confront a world he once kept at symbolic distance. Crime is no longer a frightening outline in the marsh. It is tied to names, faces, legal mechanisms, and the hidden foundations of wealth and status. Dickens suggests that society produces the very darkness it later pretends to judge from above. Class and crime are not isolated planets here. They are neighboring chambers linked by doors respectable people prefer not to see. Loyalty becomes the test. Pip, who once lived by embarrassment, begins to act by devotion. Caring for Magwitch is dangerous, inconvenient, and socially compromising. That is precisely why it matters. The novel does not offer moral growth as a beautiful speech. It offers it as attendance, arranging, concealing, accompanying, worrying, enduring. The heart ripens through repeated acts performed under pressure. There is tenderness, too, in the way Dickens allows criminality and humanity to coexist without flattening either. Magwitch has done harm. The law has claims on him. Yet his love for Pip is real. Molly, with her scarred history, exists at the edge of another buried sorrow. In this world, guilt is never the whole of a person, though it is never nothing either. That balanced vision is one of the book's great moral strengths. So the underside of respectability comes into view not to produce cynicism, but to deepen sympathy and sharpen judgment. Great Expectations asks what loyalty means once innocence has vanished, once social myths have cracked, once one knows that every polished order may conceal histories of injury and force. The answer it offers is quiet but demanding. Loyalty means seeing the human being more clearly, not less, when prestige falls away. When Pip loses his expectations, the loss is not only financial. It is imaginative, social, and inward. A whole structure of self-understanding collapses. The future he had worn like clothing comes apart, and what remains is exhaustion, illness, debt, and the shame of having misplaced his affections for so long. Yet this collapse also carries the possibility of truth, because illusions often leave the room only after they have made life unlivable. The movement back toward Joe is among the most tender in Dickens. Joe does not arrive as an accuser. He comes as care itself, practical, embarrassed by display, faithful without rhetoric. He pays debts, sits by the sickbed, watches, waits, and leaves kindness behind him as naturally as breathing. Nothing in the novel is more morally beautiful than this refusal to dramatize goodness. Joe's mercy does not perform superiority. It simply serves. For Pip, recovering tenderness means learning to see what was always before him. Joe is no longer an awkward figure to be apologized for. He becomes visible in his real stature. Biddy, too, belongs to this rediscovered order of value, where intelligence is joined to patience and affection to self-command. Great Expectations does not suggest that one should never leave home or never desire more. It suggests something harder, that one must not let ambition blind the eyes that recognize love. Illness in the novel strips away social costume. In weakness, Pip is returned almost to a childlike condition, dependent again, vulnerable again, close to the original exposure of the marshes. But now the lesson is transformed. Where terror once dominated, forgiveness approaches. Loss also changes the scale of things. The old brilliant objects no longer command the same reverence. What matters is who remains, who comes near, who tends the living when fantasy has failed. Dickens is not sentimental here because the knowledge is costly. Pip cannot undo the years of vanity. He cannot rewind the injuries of neglect. What he can do is feel them truly, and that truth itself begins to soften him. So the novel enters a humbler music. Firelight replaces spectacle. Letters matter. Quiet conversation matters. The heart, having been inflamed by false expectation, begins to cool into gratitude. Great Expectations becomes at last a story about recovering scale, about learning that tenderness is not the small thing ambition once mistook it for, but the large and sheltering thing without which no success can feel like home. By the end, Great Expectations reaches a kind of mature mercy. It does not erase suffering, and it does not pretend that damaged years can be made innocent again. Instead, it imagines identity after illusion has burned away. Pip is no longer the child of pure fear, nor the young man of social fantasy, nor the eager worshiper of distant coldness. He has passed through shame, desire, vanity, guilt, loyalty, and loss, and what remains is something quieter than triumph. That quietness matters. Dickens does not finally honor grandeur. He honors ripened perception. The mature heart in this novel is one that sees through surfaces without becoming hard, one that remembers humiliation without surrendering to bitterness, one that can look back on folly and still choose gentleness. This is why the book lasts. It speaks to a human experience broader than any single plot movement. The painful education by which we learn that what dazzles us may not save us, and what humbly saves us may not have dazzled us at all. Even the ending, with its famous uncertainty and softened hope, belongs to this mercy. The point is not the neat reward of a romance. The point is that Pip can finally meet the world with fewer illusions and more inward truth. Estella, too, is seen through a gentler lens, not because the past disappears, but because suffering has done its work on pride. In Great Expectations, maturity is not possession. It is altered sight. The novel's deepest movement, then, is from false expectation to humane attention. The marsh, the forge, Satis House, London, the prison world, the sick room, the dimly opening future. These are not just settings in a life. They are chambers in a moral architecture. Each teaches Pip and us something about what human beings worship, fear, misunderstand, and finally learn to cherish. And perhaps that is the gentle truth hidden in Dickens's title. Expectations themselves are not evil. Human beings must imagine futures in order to live. But expectations become dangerous when they are severed from gratitude, when they ask us to despise the sources of our first care, when they turn persons into instruments of our self-invention. The book leads us patiently through that fire until the dream of becoming someone grand gives way to the harder and kinder work of becoming someone real. So when great expectations comes to rest, it leaves not the clang of ambition, but the hush that follows recognition. The mist has thinned, the heart has been chastened. What remains is not splendor, but mercy. Mercy toward the flawed self, toward the wounded others who formed it, and toward the ordinary forms of love that were quietly waiting all along. And that's where this story comes to a rest. Close your eyes, carry this story with you, and slowly drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. There's always a new story waiting for you here. Sweet dreams.